Music and You was made possible by the San Luis Obispo County Office of Education and the Arts Collaborative.
You may be wondering why we're starting today's episode with a car commercial. The music from that commercial was written more than 200 years ago and is from a famous piece called the Magic Flute, written by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was a genius composer from the classical era, which is our topic of conversation on today's episode of Music and You. In our last program, we explored the Baroque period, which was from 1600 to about 1730. The Baroque era is often thought of as a musical style of exaggerated compositions to produce grand dramatic performances. The classical era is also known as the Long Era because it covers about 100 years. That's a long time, and we're going to visit this era in 2 programs. The classical period follows Baroque, and it's generally considered to be music between 1730 and 1820. It maintained many components of the Baroque tradition, but placed new emphasis on elegance and simplicity in both choral and instrumental music. During the classical era, Europe began to move towards a new style in architecture, literature, and the arts generally known as Classicism. Originating in ancient Greece and Rome, it's characterized by symmetry, columns, and rectangular windows. During the classical era, extravagance gave way to a more restrained style. Baroque architecture is highly decorative. It's characterized by elaborate forms, marble, and large-scale decoration. For example, here is a building from the Baroque period, Santiago de Compostela, from Spain. See the elaborate detailing? And here's a cathedral designed using Classicism, St. Paul's Cathedral in England. They are both beautiful, but you can see how the cathedral on the right has a more restrained kind of style compared to the Baroque style cathedral on the left. That same kind of editing was finding its way into music. The musical forms that dominated the classical era aimed to embrace order, simplicity, and strength. This is also a time period called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. It's a movement that emphasizes reason over superstition and science over blind faith. The Enlightenment was brought on by changing attitudes. For centuries, Europeans had looked to their traditions and religion as the source of truth. But Enlightenment philosophers had a different idea. They claimed that individual reason was the source of truth, and that all people are inherently equal. It also meant that nothing should be accepted simply because it is traditional. Together, these ideas promoted a belief in democracy, liberty, and equality. If these ideas sound familiar, it is because the American Revolution was very strongly influenced by the Enlightenment. So how do these ideas translate into music? Well, for one thing, the Enlightenment changed how people thought about music. Before this, fine music was mostly reserved for royalty, the highly educated, and the wealthy. It was believed that common people were unable to appreciate the fine arts. However, Enlightenment scholars challenged this tradition. They claimed that since all humans are inherently equal, all people can appreciate fine music and more people should have access to such music. During the Enlightenment, the number of amateur musicians skyrocketed as musical learning was opened to more than just the wealthy. Composers also felt they had a moral obligation to provide fine music for all the people. This idea and the general concept that the Enlightenment could challenge tradition opened up composers to a much greater range of artistic freedom. Rather than just creating music for the royal and educated elite, they produced compositions that were more universal in their appeal. Whereas Baroque music was filled with exaggeration and complex melodies, music from the Enlightenment was technically simpler. Instead of showing off skill and refinement, this new music was focused simply on enjoyment and was meant to be pleasing to everyone. There are many important composers during the classical era. For today's program, we are going to focus on two: Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Joseph Haydn was an Austrian composer who was one of the most important figures in the development of classical style music. He helped establish the forms and styles for the string quartet and the symphony. In 1750, Haydn was hired to write music for an aristocrat and some of his friends who played music together. They played the violin, the viola, the cello, and another violin. And this became the standard string quartet. Haydn's compositions were so well liked that people started hiring composers to do the same thing, and his string quartet form took off. Haydn is credited with creating the modern form of chamber music we know today. He wrote 68 string quartets, 45 piano trios, and numerous other small ensemble compositions. Haydn is also often called the father of the symphony. However, that's not entirely true. Composers of the Baroque era were using the symphonic form, but it was Haydn who brought the symphony to life. In 1761, Haydn was hired by Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. The prince lived in many palaces, wore extravagant clothing, and had a love of opera and grand musical productions. Haydn was hired to provide the musical score for this lavish lifestyle. Haydn was the composer in residence for the Esterházy family for 30 years. During that time, Haydn embraced the symphony and infused the form with energy, depth, brightness, and emotion. Today's modern symphony springs from Haydn's work. Joseph Haydn wrote 104 symphonies, and his works were very inspirational for our next composer, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. More than any other composer, Mozart used all of the forms of his day, and he excelled in every single one. His father was also a composer and a violinist, and he recognized very early that his son Wolfgang was musically gifted. As a young child, he could play the harpsichord and the violin. Mozart was composing music by the time he was 5 years old. His father took him on a European tour to many royal courts and noble houses to play. By the time Mozart was just 8 years old, he had written his first symphony. Even in its simplicity, it is packed with action fanfares and surprising soft moments. As a young man, Mozart worked in Salzburg. First, he was an assistant conductor. Later, he was an organist. During this time, he wrote his first serious opera. It was performed in 1781, just after Mozart's 25th birthday. Later that year, Mozart moved to Vienna and became a successful pianist and composer. In Vienna, Mozart wrote some of his best works for piano and orchestra. So why did Mozart stand out in the classical era? There are actually quite a few reasons. Mozart's operas are timeless works, featuring perfect dramatic pacing, lifelike characters, and themes that make them seem fresh and relevant even today. He has a wonderful sense of drama in all of his works, from piano sonatas to string quartets to his symphonies. An aria is a classical musical form composed for a solo voice. Arias are usually contained within a larger musical work, such as an opera. Mozart wrote one of the most famous arias of all time. It is called Hell's Vengeance Boils in My Heart. That sounds dramatic, doesn't it? It is sung by the Queen of the Night, a character from his last opera called the Magic Flute. The Magic Flute showcases Mozart's ability to combine new and old. He blended popular theater, folk music, and opera. Some say Mozart spoke 15 languages, and his early tours throughout Europe exposed him to many musical styles. He masterfully incorporated these foreign forms into his own body of work. Audiences always looked forward to something fun and new in a Mozart production. However, Mozart also composed deeply emotional and complex works. His last commission is shrouded in mystery. A stranger turned up at Mozart's door asking the composer to write a requiem, which is a religious ceremony for someone who has died. Mozart would be paid, but he would never know the identity of this mystery patron. Not only is it a mystery, but it was a difficult composition for Mozart, who was not feeling well at the time. Mozart actually died while writing this requiem. This religious composition showcases Mozart's mature style, and it is one of the most moving pieces in all of classical music. During his short life, he composed more than 50 symphonic works and 15 operas. He also wrote many works for choir, orchestra, and smaller groups of instruments. Although his works are more than 200 years old, they are still very popular today. I am here today with one of my favorite people on the planet, Araceli. Araceli is a sophomore over at Cal Poly. She plays viola like I do, and she's one of my students. She is from Los Angeles, and we're lucky to have her today. Before we get into our lesson here, could you tell me one of the things that you really enjoy just in general about being a student at Cal Poly in the music program?
I really enjoy playing with the the Cal Poly Symphony. It's just really fun to be with other people like that are not music majors and just get to play with them. It's
Absolutely.
nice.
And it's not easy what you do. So what's one, could you tell our audience what's one of the biggest challenges about being a music major?
I think it's the workload. It's like I have music classes on top of regular classes. It's just work on work on work. Just like trying to find that time to get everything in balance.
And then you have a teacher that says you need to practice 3 hours a day on top of all that. It's almost like being an athlete. Like you have this whole other thing that you need to do.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump right into it. So we've been talking about the classical era today. And the reason I brought you in is you're playing the Hofmeister Viola Concerto, which is a classical piece. So let's jump in. And why don't you just play at the beginning for me?
Okay.
Good, good. Nice, Araceli. So, Araceli, what's one of the elements of what you've been working on that you specifically towards classical music that you've been thinking about quite a bit as you work through this piece?
Specifically towards classical music would definitely be articulation.
Good answer.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to work on a little bit. So can we did this a little bit last week and it still needs a little work. I still feel, I mean, as you start this, you're starting a concerto. And let's remind our audience, what is a concerto? That's you and a full orchestra.
Full orchestra.
So as you start this, you need to, they've been playing, the orchestra's already been playing, there's been no solo. You need to announce your presence, and we're going to do that with articulation. And that's one of the things that really helps define the classical era. So that first note, it's an open A, right?
Yeah.
So easy to think about. Not really. We want a nice, clean, and not. So the first note, Araceli, is where you're really going to announce yourself. The orchestra's been playing. You need to announce your presence as you come in. And I think we really want to think about articulation there, especially since it's an open A, right? We don't. It's very easy to make it, you know, a really ugly sound. But we can use the power of the open A and a good articulation to. Right? So can you just try those first two chords a little bit and think big, like you're challenging a whole orchestra. Good, good. And now let's think about the articulation down here as well. Can you just, don't worry about the intonation. Good. And longer. Good. Now. Very nice. Can you start this again and now play for a little bit? One more time. You heard it. We're not hearing that. We want to hear that low D. What key is this piece in?
D major.
D major. So it's important to hear that low D. Good. And as usual, I'm going to be really picky, as I am with you. That sounded wimpy. No. Even more with that, like, again, challenge the whole orchestra with that first note. Good. Now, I love where we're at because you're getting very critical of yourself right now, too. And that's a great, don't get overly critical, but I want you to always be this picky when you're practicing. Good. Keep going a little. Sorry, just a little longer on the A. And go one more time and go on. Go on. Yeah, those are the tunes. Those are because we have that D repeated, right? We play it twice. It's very easy for it to sound kind of all mushed into one. Try that. Strong, strong. Good. Do you hear the instrument kind of
Yeah.
pop when you grab that articulation? And I really want you to keep working on that. It's really an important element for this entire first movement and the third movement that you haven't come to yet. Araceli, that was a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Go back and continue to work on your articulations. I know you will. And thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Next time, we will introduce you to Ludwig van Beethoven, who's another master of the classical era.